Thank you all so much for coming out here today. It's wonderful to have a very nice showing, especially on a very nice day on the second day of term. So, I appreciate the fact that you all want to come and learn something today. So I'm very, very pleased to this being our first talk of this academic year. Obviously, it's the second day of term. I guess we could have had one yesterday, but that would be really rough. And it's a great talk, I'm hoping, and it's a great person we're having at least, so I'm expecting it to be a great talk. So I'd really like to welcome Tom Ginsburg. He is the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law at the University of Chicago, and he also has an appointment in the Department of Political Science. He is the director of the Chicago Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's published like 5 books and edited 24 or something now. Tons of journal articles. One of the leading comparative constitutional scholars in the world. And he's gonna be here to give a talk on institutional neutrality. So please welcome Tom Ginsburg.
Thanks everyone for coming today, and thank you Brad for the invitation. It is my first time in Kelowna, although I've been in British Columbia many times before. I'm really excited. What a beautiful place to be. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you. As Brad said, I'm a professor mainly of international law and comparative constitutional law. And so what am I doing talking about something called institutional neutrality? What is that? And the answer is that in recent years, I've been working a lot on democratic backsliding around the world. I work all over the world, and I've been to a lot of countries where democracy once seemed very robust and then has been, whittled away by various forces. And in my work on that, I have learned that universities are very soft targets. Inside the university, you think this is such a robust institution. But in fact, we're very susceptible to politicization, particularly in a polarized era like we're in Canada and the United States. There are certain vulnerabilities, and I think we've been exhibiting those. I'll say a little bit more about that. But that led me to start something at the University of Chicago called the Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression, which is 1 year old. We launched on October 6th last year, right before the world changed significantly in terms of campus speech because of the events in Israel and Gaza. And what we're trying to do with that is to promote and deepen people's free expression on campus, their ability to converse with each other across difference, to push back against various illiberal forces which are threatening academic freedom around the world. And I should say before I go any further, I don't know anything about the Canadian environment. I'm coming from a southern perspective, I guess you would say here. And so I really look forward to dialogue and to hearing your questions because your environment really might be quite different. I thought I'd actually start with the idea of academic freedom. And then I'll talk a little bit about the University of Chicago and its particular position in these debates. And then I'll get to my advertised topic, a constitutional perspective on institutional neutrality. But let's start with academic freedom. Academic freedom, what is it? If you're a student, you probably don't know. If you're a professor, you probably don't know because no one has ever talked to you about it. One of the things I learned in recent years is that, in my experience, I've been doing this for over 2 decades, no one ever tells you what academic freedom is or why we have it. What is the case for academic freedom? And that's certainly true if you're a student. So I just thought I would introduce the idea. It really goes back in its modern form to the formation of German universities, particularly the Humboldt University in Berlin in the early part of the 19th century. And William von Humboldt, who started that university, articulated the idea that what a university is for research and discovery. And to do that, you needed 2 freedoms: freedom to teach and freedom to learn. That's how he articulated it. Freedom to teach and freedom to learn. And you can think about that as, in our modern sense, as freedom in the classroom for the professor to approach the material however she wants, but also freedom of researchers, and this would include students. Students are learners and members of a scholarly community, to be able to undertake their research and wherever it takes them, and that they shouldn't be constrained in some sense by the broader institution of which they're part. it also meant, and it came to mean and came to develop to the idea that not only was academic freedom an individual level characteristic, which each professor has, each researcher, but also a kind of a corporate or collective right for institutions, for universities as a whole. And the key idea here is that for academic freedom to work, for people to be able to study in whatever field, let's just take political science, the judgments about who gets those jobs and the judgments about who gets rewarded and such should be made by other people who are in the field. That academia was a kind of expertise, a profession, and that the only people able to judge that were themselves academics. And you might think, well, who else would do it? Obviously, the threat is the state, that the state might choose, oh, we don't like Epperle's research. You know, maybe he's a communist or something. Well, he's going to get fired. Or we don't like this feminist scholar or something like that. It's too sensitive. We're going to fire that person. So the idea of a collective autonomy of scholars to make decisions about what we're doing relies very heavily on sort of people within the discipline, but it's basically a claim to expertise. And you might think about other fields in which we have this. In order to know, we do this in the law, for example, in order to know whether a surgeon did a good or bad job, what do? We ask other surgeons. You don't rely on the ordinary layperson to make that decision. Legal malpractice. We're often in situations where we allow professionals to make a judgment. And that's basically what academic freedom is, a claim of professional expertise. It really crystallizes in the United States between about 1890 and the first part of the 20th century. And that happens to be right when the University of Chicago, where I teach, was founded. And so a lot of the ideas that were in the air at the time really influenced our particular university. And what were the ideas at that particular time in American history? It was the so-called progressive era. And what did the progressives stand for? They believed in science. They believed in expertise. They were a little distrustful of politics. One of the famous phrases of the time is that there's no Democrat or Republican way to pave a street. There's only one way to pave a street. The technical, scientifically correct, best engineered street is not a political matter. It's an expert matter. So this was an era where they really trusted expertise. And if you think about what was going on more broadly, it was also an area of class conflict, of industrialization, society really rethinking itself in very fundamental ways. But one answer to that was, I guess you'd call it a small L liberal idea in which we should maximize people's freedom, we could trust experts, and academics were part of that. And so this is kind of the era in which these things are really in the air. Our university was founded really on three ideas. And there's a very early statement where donors were pressuring the university president. They didn't like basically a proto-communist professor who was talking about class conflict in the 1890s. And they were leaning on the president of the university. And his response was to convene a group of faculty and administrators, and they articulated a couple core positions. Free speech is absolutely critical. You can't limit academic discourse. That principle was so core to the university, they said, that it should never be questioned. It was like a kind of a constitutional value for them. And the third thing they articulated back in the 1890s was that the institution did not take positions on the issues of the day. In other words, there was no University of Chicago position on communism versus capitalism, on Republicans versus Democrats, on World War I, on any of the controversies of the day. Their vision was the university was simply the host of scholars who would themselves debate these things. And that the way progress was made in academia was through intense internal debate and conflict and challenge, and the continuous questioning of ideas that would lead to progress, the progressive era. Progress would come from open debate and discourse. And as a result, their conception of the institution was that it was not really an entity capable of taking positions on the issues of the day. Now, why did they do that? I think one reason is that they were worried about the pressure from donors at that time. John Rockefeller gave the money to set up our institution, and he was the richest man in the world. I think there's maybe possibly the richest man ever in human history in terms of the percentage of global wealth that he had. He invented Standard Oil, had monopolies all the way up and down. And he gave money for this university, and then I think, thought, well, yeah, that means I get to control things. And so this stance was articulated as a way of saying, no, this is a professional enterprise in which whoever pays the piper does not get to call the tune. And indeed, many of the kind of sense of the early academics of the progressive era have exactly that kind of character. Arthur Lovejoy, who's one of the founders of something called the American Association of University Professors, which was founded in 1914, said, look, the scholar's craft is not capable of being done if whoever pays the piper calls the tune. Okay, so that's a kind of vision that dates from the early 20th century. Where are we now? Well, I think we're suffering from grave threats to academic freedom, to the idea of free inquiry, and to the idea of the scholar as a professional who's capable of trying to answer some of the most pressing questions in society through intense research and internal debate. And I think the pressure in some sense is the same that they recognized in the early 20th century. And that has to do with who pays the piper. If you think about it, this building, the whole campus, it didn't just pop up. God didn't throw it down on the sixth day. It took money, right? And all universities need money to be capable of their operation. And there's basically three sources of money for all universities all over the world. The state, very important in Canada, even important for big private universities in the United States. And the state is always a threat to free inquiry because there's always a temptation on the part of state bureaucrats and politicians to try to manipulate the environment and try to steer things. So that's one source of threat. It's a very grave one in my country right now. We have state legislatures which are passing all kinds of rules about university policies on who we can admit, university policies on what can be said on certain issues like abortion, university policies on tenure. There's a lot of threat of interference, and I think that's not going to get much better. Universities have, in other words, been perceived, for better or worse, as on one side of the political aisle, and that means that the threat from state power is a very real one, because more than half the country thinks that we don't represent them, we don't reflect their views, that we're not welcoming of their views, that we don't look like the country in that sense. So state power is a critical source of money and a threat. Second source of money, donors, which now, as then, is always a threat. You can take money from private sources, but it's, of course, especially important when you do so, if you're the university leadership, to make clear that all academic decisions will be made by academics and the donor should have no influence. And I'm at a rich private university in the United States, not that rich, we're having a financial crisis, but relatively speaking, we're doing okay. And we've gotten very good, I think, the leadership, at saying to donors, yeah, we'll take your money for this, but we won't, you can't steer this, or you're being too controlling, we don't want that money. But that is nevertheless a source of threat. Where else could you get money if not the state and donors? Well, from you guys, from students, from tuition. And tuitions have risen throughout much of the Western world. There's always this temptation, I suppose, in a state system like this to have more out-of-state students and out-of-province students who will pay more tuition. It's a complicated thing. But why is that a threat to the free expression in the university or the threat to academic freedom? There is a sense in which the modern university has become a large corporate entity, and the students then become customers. And the customer, of course, is always right. The problem with that perspective, of course, would be, and I'm sure this has never happened at this university, but when you get people who don't want to be confronted with ideas they already think they disagree with. They're so sure that the other side is so wrong that they don't even want it to be present on the campus. And we've had, in recent years, many cancellations of speakers. We've had people, shouting down speakers who they think they disagree with, and we've had professors get in trouble for bringing things in the classroom which people think that they don't want to hear. And the problem with that, there's a lot of problems with that view, but you could see why it's a kind of a threat to academic freedom, to taking the ideas wherever they lead you. The problem with that particular thing, I'll just say as an aside, when you shout down a speaker, you're not just hurting that speaker, you're actually patronizing the other students in the class or the place, you're patronizing every potential hearer of that speaker because you're saying these ideas are so poisonous that you, third party, cannot be exposed to them because you will automatically be convinced. And that is very patronizing, right? You should, in fact, respect the autonomy of your fellow classmates to hear controversial ideas and sort things out. So I say all this to just say academic freedom is super important. It is under some threat in the Western world, in many other backsliding environments, and so it's worth thinking about how to protect it and how to restore it, I guess I should say, how to get back to a place where we are able, and maybe back is the wrong term, I don't want to say that there was a golden era, but to at least recall the core values of what makes a university a university. Now again, the University of Chicago has kind of a particular place in this discussion in the United States because we were founded in that particular era. Harvard was older, Yale was founded on slave money. There were older institutions that were founded basically as kind of theological institutions originally. And University of Chicago just happened to be lucky to be founded at this era and to get certain values put into its sort of founding DNA. But they were tested sorely in the 20th century. 20th century was a very repressive one in the United States when it came to university and when it came to free speech. And if you look at the course of the 20th century, there were two issues that really posed challenges. One I've already hinted at, which is communism, right? Leftist ideas, class conflict, those are evil, dangerous ideas. They might lead to the overthrow of our system. Communists, of course, presented a completely alternative, non-liberal way of organizing society. We'd better not let them on campus. We better fire professors who express communist ideas. And this, of course, happened throughout the 20th century. The McCarthy period is very famous for this. And so that's one source of threat. The other issue that really challenged ideas of academic freedom was war. And the United States, as you know, is a fairly warlike nation. We go to war a lot. And how dare anyone on the campus criticize our ability to go to war? In World War I, Columbia University, to cite a famous example, fired professors who were anti-war. You're gone. So that's obviously incompatible with academic freedom. We just see this kind of repressive environment throughout, sort of rises and falls throughout American history around those two issues. I'm sad to report that we might be in such an era again. There's apparently some evidence that as many professors have been fired in the last few years for things that they said in the classroom as in the entire McCarthy period of anti-communism. And that should be very disturbing. It suggests that, again, there's a kind of new censoriousness, new repressiveness, and that we have to keep the university pure of bad ideas. All right, so what happened at the University of Chicago? Our leaders were very early on and consistent in pushing back against this. A very famous thing from the 1930s, when there was a huge anti-communist hysteria going on, there was a state legislative inquiry into whether there were communists at the university. And the university president was called before the legislature. That's not a pleasant experience. That's not much fun. But what did he say? He said, the university, he defined, as a community of scholars. The university is a community of scholars. It is not a kindergarten. It is not a reform school. It is not a club. It is not a political party. It is not an agency of propaganda. It is a community of scholars. And that, to me, is really an important vision which we ought to recall. Our purpose is not necessarily to provide new inventions for the society. It is not to change society in any fundamental way. That might be something individual scholars do. Individual students certainly want to do that. But it's not the purpose of the institution. The institution is an environment in which people will debate issues to discover truth or get close to it. We know it's an impossible ideal. And it's kind of a pure vision of knowledge for its own sake. For this reason, they did not fire communists. And there's actually a point in the 1940s when Edward Levy, who later became the Attorney General of the United States as a faculty member, wrote a statement that says, hey, we see that all these communists are being fired from other universities. We don't care if our scholars are communists or not. If you are a communist and you've been fired and you're a good scholar, come on, we'll hire you here. A very brave thing to do in the McCarthy period. So we've always had this kind of role as something of a beacon, and to kind of defend the idea of inquiry and expression and trying to keep politics from interfering with the scholarly enterprise. People have their private politics. All right, so now let's come to our era. One of the features of our era, for better or worse, is that we live in the era of the institutional statement. Anything happens in the world, we want our institutions to speak out. We want statements. Everyone, many of you might go onto Twitter to express your view about X or Y issue. And that, of course, is part of free expression. You're certainly entitled to do that. But there is a sense in which we want our institutions to reflect our values, and we fight about them. Because, of course, the condition of modern democracy is that we are a plural society. We have all kinds of different views within a community like a university community. When universities make statements on issues that don't directly affect them, they're essentially inviting a contestation within the community over that voice. And so now I want to turn to this constitutional perspective on the problem. Institutions are making statements. It's gotten them in a lot of trouble this last year. It's very easy to make statements on which everyone agrees. Vladimir Putin is a bad guy. It's not a very controversial thing to say in an American university or a North American university. It's a little harder when you have issues which actually divide the community, right? And this is where the Gaza stuff comes in. It's not obvious that when a university president is speaking, they're reflecting the view of everybody in the community. In fact, it might be internally divisive, and it's led to a lot of internal conflict in universities. What is constitutional? How can constitutional analysis help us? Well, countries, democracies, like universities, are composed of plural groups of people, plural identities, plural ideas. And democracy is a system in which we debate those things, knowing that even if we lose, we're going to survive. We're going to be able to fight another day. Our party lost this election, that's okay, we'll come back next time. You know, we made our case for this argument or this policy, we lost, all right, we can still keep fighting. Democracies work, of course, not through just total unbridled competition. They work because they have constitutional structures. And what is it that constitutions do for democracy? Well, constitutions do a lot of things. First of all, they provide the governance structure, right? Who's going to be elected premier and how do you do that? Who are the courts? What's the roles of institutions? They sometimes provide a vision of fundamental values. We, the people, in order to establish a more perfect union, this kind of thing. We have these kind of statements that are there which mobilize us and make us feel like we're part of the same community. And then the third thing, and this is the most important for my purpose, constitutions work because they channel political competition into problems that can be solved and away from problems that cannot be solved. If we, everyone in this room, are citizens of a country and we want to debate any issue, you know, we might argue and we'll debate, and it's very likely that even if we talk for a long time, there'd be some people who disagree, and but we might have a majority decision that we would take on a particular thing. There are certain kind of problems which, in a country, it's acceptable to resolve by majority rule. How much money we're going to spend on guns versus butter? What's going to be the tax on alcohol or something like that? You know, there's kinds of things where, you know, I might disagree with it, but I can live with losing. But there are also problems that arise in constitutional democracy which are existential to the minority. If we were to, for example, have a majority vote to decide what's the best religion in the country, imagine that. Well, what would happen? Well, we'd have a lot of politicking around what's the best religion, and you'd have some people who lost the vote who'd be very, very, very unhappy. There are countries where this happens, and they usually end up in massive civil war. What a constitution does is it takes those problems off the table of politics. I have a right to practice my religion, doesn't matter who's in the majority. And because of that, I know that even if I lose in political competition, I'm not going to lose so badly that my core interests are threatened. I can live with the result. Constitutions, by taking things off the table, lower the stakes of democratic politics so that we can channel our political energy into problems we can solve with majority rule and away from others. Now, what on earth, you may be saying, does this have to do with the university? To me, a university policy of institutional neutrality, which I'll define shortly, is analogous to this. By institutional neutrality, I don't mean, some idealized version of what's neutral and what's not. I mean that the university itself does not take positions on the issues of the day unless they directly affect the university. That's what I'm talking about here. Now, you might say, well, if the majority really feels like this particular issue is really important, or this is an existential, expressive issue for our particular community, maybe we should say something about it. And that might be true in some instances. My thought, though, is that when you do put on the table the voice of the deputy vice chancellor or the provost or the university president, when that person's voice is open to contestation, what's going to happen? We are going to spend a lot of energy politicking to get them to say what we want them to say. And that's a waste of energy in the sense that it is taking us away from the core mission of universities, which is inquiry and discovery and learning. All that time could be spent even developing arguments for one or the other side of a controversial issue, doing scholarship on the relevant controversial issue, learning more about it, teaching more about it. Instead, we end up fighting and fighting over basically trying to get the university president to make a bland statement about some foreign policy issue, which will have, of course, at least in the case of foreign policy, no impact whatsoever. That's what's become of modern universities. We end up fighting. And you could see that, I know you're thinking, well, this is about Gaza and Israel, but it's a much older problem. It's a much older problem, but I think it's a good illustration, I suppose, of what happens when we do put the institutional voice on the table. We fight. And there's a lot of fighting and a lot of demand, in some sense a demand to coerce the institution to say preferred words. And should be very clear, I'm not blaming one side or the other. In the last year, at American universities, after October 7th, we had a few days, at University of Chicago, we had pressure from alumni and others saying, you need to speak out to condemn these Hamas attacks. And 6 months later, we had students camped out saying, you need to say the word scholasticide. And both are demands to capture the institutional voice. In our case, because we have this long tradition, we didn't say anything. But other universities have been saying things for a long time and talking about lots of different issues, and they felt sometimes that they had to make statements. And that's fine, but it was in some sense, distraction in this particular case without any plausible consequence in the real world. It's not like Netanyahu and Sinwar are saying, oh my God, the University of California leader has called for a ceasefire. Oh, okay, that's going to do it. But that's the sort of theory, I suppose, behind the statements and such. And so I think the constitutional perspective says, let's lower the stakes of institutional governance. Let's lower it and channel the energy into problems we can solve. We do not select deputy vice chancellors because they are moral leaders. We do not select them because they have a unique vision. We might, in the modern world, select them because of their ability to craft bland statements that satisfy both sides of a contested moral question. That's actually probably a job requirement these days. Is that really what we want? I don't think so. I think we want people who have values and can lead an institution and make it better for everyone, people's ability to inquire and to speak. So the same idea, the same way that constitutions lower the stakes of politics and thus make politics possible in a democracy, a prior commitment to institutional neutrality lowers the stakes of the university administration and allows us to do what we do. And what we do is really important. As I started my talk, I was saying that we're under some grave threat. And everything that happens in a modern university, we're working on really important problems: inequality, legacies of racial discrimination, climate change, all kinds of really important things. And the society needs us to work on those things. We can't solve those problems without research, without universities. They're hard problems. Some of them are wicked problems. So what we do is important. It's precisely because it's important that we should insulate ourselves. Now let me say one other thing, which is some of you might be thinking to yourself, neutrality. Well, nothing is neutral, right? And it's a very common reaction one gets, institutional neutrality. The phrase comes from the 1960s in a document called the Calvin Report at the University of Chicago, where there was pressure to divest from the war industries in the Vietnam era. And a university committee got together and says, the university is the home of critics. We are not itself the critic. The university cannot speak itself, and we can't thus invest or divest for political reasons. Now we can talk about divestment. It's kind of a slightly different problem. But the point is that the vision was one of institutional neutrality. Nowadays, neutrality is a word that people don't believe in anymore. And yet I think there is something there. I think if you really inquire, you would say, no, there really is something to the idea. Kwame Anthony Appiah, the great philosopher at New York University, says, it's sort of an impossible but necessary ideal. We can't ever get to true neutrality. We're all socially situated. At the same time, we don't want, for example, a university president, the idea that there's no pure neutral position doesn't mean that all bets are off. You wouldn't want your deputy vice chancellor to endorse, Justin Trudeau or the other guy's name. What's that? Sorry. Polyev, sorry. I know I'm being recorded. Don't come back at me later. Polyev, that would be inappropriate, right? That would be a deep error that would put their university at grave risk. If neutrality is impossible, why do we take that issue off the table? One of those people might be better for higher education. Maybe we want the leaders to weigh in. No, we don't want them to do so. We need to cultivate the image of ourselves collectively striving for that neutral and correct solution, even though we know it's an impossible one. And this is where universities are really critical because they are collectivities. I do social science research. I have my biases. I, socially situated like all of us. And a good social scientist will be honest with you and admit those things and also constantly be working to purge their research of those biases, to be asking questions about how can I get this right? How can I get to causal inference, for example, as economists like to say. And it's really hard work. And you know what? It's best done in a community. It's best done in conversation with others. Because as hard as I work at trying to get to a neutral position, am not going to see my own biases. And that's why I need other people to challenge me and correct me. And so a good community of inquiry is one in which people are challenging each other freely and openly. And that clash, if you will, is what will produce the ideas that we need to solve those problems of climate change and inequality and such. Without it, we're going to have a much more biased and much less progress on important issues. So in some sense, what I'm saying is ideology is the enemy of inquiry. Ideology is the enemy of neutrality. And even if, again, I don't want to get hung up on the word neutrality. I know it bothers some people, but I think there is something there that's really important for a community of scholars. So just to return to that idea, and then we can open it up, Robert Maynard Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago in the 30s, we're a community of scholars. We're not a political party. We're not an agency of propaganda. We're not a kindergarten. Students are not children. They're minds. And those minds have to be cultivated, and to do that, it's best done in conversation with others. But if you're afraid to speak, you can't really make much progress. Or if you do speak and you get called names, that you can't make much progress. So this is really hard work. I guess maybe that's the last thing I'll say. It's a particularly hard moment for this kind of inquiry. It's a hard moment because we're in a social media era where, you're afraid you say something wrong on the social media, it's there forever, and people are going to yell at you, you get Twitter mobbed. It's a hard, even for faculty, some of my junior faculty admit, to me that, gosh, I'm just afraid I'm going to slip up in class and the students are going to, Twitter mob me or something. It's like, so that's really bad for inquiry. Now, to overcome it, I think we need to restore some trust in the institution from society, and I think we really have to work hard to come up with techniques and ways and environments in which speech can occur, in which conversation can occur. It's not going to happen on its own. Free speech sounds like the absence of constraint. You need much more than that. But a first step, in my humble opinion, is institutional neutrality as far as social and political issues of the day. Now, I realize there's one last thing I didn't say, and then I will open it up. There's an exception to institutional neutrality, even at the University of Chicago, in the Calvin Report, and that is if there's some force out in society which is threatening this community of scholars, if there's something which is attacking education, then not only do we have the right to speak as the university, as an institution, but we have a duty. It's almost like this idea of the community of scholars is so precious, and the job of the university, the main job of the university is to defend that against outside forces that want to attack it. And that has led, for example, in my university president made a submission about affirmative action. Because they said, well, we think that's a core issue for our university to be able to pick and choose our students, so we believe in that. When the Trump administration came in and wanted to shut down immigration, that's a huge problem for universities because our students and our faculty couldn't get back, so he spoke up at that point. Those kind of issues, the view is that you should speak up on, but a university shouldn't have a foreign policy, I don't think, because it's simply an exercise in allowing the voice to be captured for no real significant end. And with that, I will stop, and Brad, you wanted to ask me a question or two? We can do that.
Yeah, so, which is I'm really just going to follow up on something Tom was stressing, which is the idea of a community of scholars. And I think that one of the other things that is very critical about institutional neutrality is that a lack of it is really divisive and undermines the community of scholars. So I'm looking around at faculty in this room, and we have an incredibly diverse number of political opinions in this room. And yet we operate collectively as a department, a faculty, as a university in a way that doesn't bring those things in, right? But if suddenly some of us want to, or are able to capture the university and have the university speak for our subset, even if we're a majority, right? Suddenly that makes inter-faculty or faculty-student community relations potentially very, very divisive. And so that is something that I think we really need to think about, is not even in the sense of it having some bigger implication in a normative sense, which of course it does, but in just a sort of like, do you want to live in an environment where your community is constantly trying to get a slight majority so that its goals can be pursued at the expense of the other members of your community? Faculty stay around for a long time at lots of universities, and it probably isn't such, and I've been in departments that are toxic. Or one, not this one. I'm glad it's on YouTube, no. And so that's something I think that we need to think about. But my first question really that I wanted you to think about, Tom, was if you wanted to make a few comments on the role of epistemic humility when it comes to institutional neutrality.
Yeah, right. So in general, it's a huge virtue, right? Epistemic humility, the idea that we might be wrong. That's how knowledge progresses. I have this, I have a theory of judicial review. I have some evidence to support it. It looks like, to my mind, it's the right theory, but I might be wrong, which is why we have a community of scholars coming up and criticizing it and trying to poke holes in it and to show that we might not other be. It might be otherwise than I think. Now, institutional neutrality, in a way, it's a sign, first of all, that we are internally plural, that on the issues on which the university is speaking, we're a community and we might not have a single view. But if there is a single view, why is it that the leadership has the secret knowledge to that particular answer to the question? So in a way, I think it evidences a humility on the part of the leadership to not purport to speak for the entire community, for a plural community. It's an act of great hubris to think that you should. I sometimes get the question, institutional neutrality, you're just being a coward if you're not speaking up about X or Y social issue that's going on out there. And I think the opposite is true. I think it takes courage to admit that you might not know. It's hard. It's just hard to, it's a human thing. We like to think we're right. And we interpret new evidence, psychologists tell us, to confirm our prior positions, not to challenge them. And so that's again why epistemic humility is core and why you really need a community of people willing to challenge you in order to correct for potential biases.
And then, so a lot of this idea about constitutional politics being removed from ordinary politics and it being at like a second level or a higher level of politics that is harder to get at comes from a lot of political economy work on constitutions and the role of constitutions in politics. And I'm thinking about some other work in a political economy on whether or not constitutions are self-enforcing documents and how they're not self-enforcing documents.
Yeah.
So if we want to view this as like a constitutional rule, right, because constitutions are pieces of paper, they don't necessarily enforce themselves, right? Someone has to enforce them. Given an age of deteriorating faculty governance, where administrators take more and more power and the faculty have less and less power,
yeah.
and the students have more and more power, what do we do about institutional neutrality or constitutional rules? Like how would we enforce these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the idea basically in a constitutional democracy, you say, well, why does Trudeau not declare a state of emergency and arrest us all? Well, the answer is he really couldn't do that because the people who were supposed to carry out that order wouldn't do it. Or, it's not because the courts would tell him no, it's because at the end of the day, those rules are self-enforcing. The community itself would not let them happen. And in the case of universities, we are mainly self-enforcing communities. Academia is a kind of self-policing body, the collection of universities. But we are subject to outside pressures. And that's where this legislation is coming in that I think threatens to upend our ability to be self-governing and thus should force intense internal introspection into what went wrong and how we can restore a kind of system in which governance is self-enforcing. There's a kind of general phenomenon that people talk about, the presidentialization of universities. I hate to use the American term, but like that whoever is the boss is like making huge decisions. Some of you might have watched the congressional hearings last year where 3 or 4 university presidents were called up to answer about, from the river to the sea and, do you tolerate claims of genocide? And they kind of bungled it and they got fired and such. But they were in position to do that because there's just been a huge, flow of power to the center. But at the end of the day, you can't run a university without faculty and students, and their voices will be heard. So I think there is a sense of self-enforcement if those values are widely shared. At my place, if the president, he has a lot of power on paper, but if he was to violate his mandate and start speaking up about, endorsing Donald Trump or something like that, just talking about political issues, the faculty would go crazy, and we would go to the trustees and get him fired. And so at the end of the day, it's kind of required, self-enforcement is possible, but it requires widespread agreement on what's fundamental and what's not.
Thank you all so much for coming, especially here on the second day of term on a beautiful, gorgeous late summer day. And of course, most of all, thanks to Tom Ginsburg for coming. Thank you very much.